You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Greetings, everybody. Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku. We are continuing our read of the book Nationbuilding. Again, if you want this book, join the Discord. The link is in the description, as well as pinned to the top of the chat. You can get your copy of this book yourself and read along with us. Before I get into the reading, I want to remind you guys that this show is part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. There are other shows that you are invited to check out on the network.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the Revolutionary Matron on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Check out all those shows on KWAZ Radio. Shout out to the other hosts on the other shows who are in the chat room right now. The Pro-Black Perspective says peace. The Revolutionary Matron from the Learning Curve podcast says greetings, everyone. Kevin Carre is here saying greetings. NYC Beauties is here as well. Thank all of you for being here. Make sure you guys hit the like button. Let's get the likes matching the viewers. Make sure you hit the like button. Also, for you guys who listen to this show regularly, the whole roster of KWAZ Radio is going to be a part of what's called the Solution Summit. Dorico Cooper Photography says peace, family, peace to him too. On September 11th, we're having this Solution Summit, so you guys want to make sure you're subscribed, make sure you're tuned in to us on social media so you get all the updates. And the easiest way to get updated is to join the Discord. The link is in the description, as well as pinned to the top of the chat. Okay, good to see all of you guys here today. Dorico, always a pleasure to see you. Dorico's Cooper Photography says hit the like button to show attendance. You know, always good to see all of you guys. The Matron was on earlier with another great show on economics. So make sure if you weren't there, you're in the live, make sure you go back and check it out. Harsh Reality Podcast just dropped an episode on Sunday night. Brand new episode. You guys make sure go check those episodes out. The Pro-Black Perspective also on Sunday had a great show about culture. Much food for thought in that episode. You also really want to check out that episode as well. All right? And I think tonight we might talk a little culture tonight as well, but we'll see how far we get. So we're reading Nationbuilding. And we're going to start from where we left off last time, which is history as a weapon of cultural aggression. It follows that the major weapon of cultural aggression and the major prop of cultural alienation, inferiorization, is historical distortion. The current adversarial and often hysterical reaction against African Centered thought is found in its greatest intensity among white academia, policymakers, and most recently, publications like Time Magazine and the Washington Post, the Washington Times, and other major newspapers. This adversarial reaction towards Afrikan Centered education can be seen as an automatic reaction of the white supremacist mind to defend the established racial or national hierarchy. The outstanding strategy made so abundantly clear as the white propaganda machine recently cranked out non-stop anti-Hussein Iraq gibberish includes trivialization, ridicule, and villainization. And this trivialization, ridicule, and villainization, that's the kind of stuff you see on Reddit and all that stuff. You know, the We Was Kangs memes and all that kind of stuff. That's a part of that, right? So this white propaganda machine is actually white culture, right? According to the Times Magazine writers, the Afrocentrism movement is a cult within the multiculturalism movement, led by opportunists and con artists and based on superficial research and a misreading of history. A cult that further threatens to balkanize, break up, or disunite the American nation state and redefine the American personality with the heightened risk of civil or ethnic conflict. They act somewhat cynically, who are we? And you know, America's been playing this little game that unfortunately a lot of our folks have been susceptible to, have fallen to. This game of, well, if you guys try to be empowered, right, if you guys try to push your nationalism, it's going to create this conflict in America, and it'll basically disunite America. Listen, America ain't united anyway. There's no way ever that the population that you had enslaved can be united with the slaver population. But they do that type of stuff. It's a strategy. They do that to confuse black folks, right? Those who are gullible enough to being confused by such a thing, right? The major focus of the argument and the point around which the most intense rhetorical invective is generated is a matter of historical revision. The historical controversy revolves essentially around the origins of civilization and the historical basis of the contemporary political and economic dominance of whites in the world. On the first issue, the question is whether Homo sapien was Africoid. Although he originated in Africa, and his or her distinctly Africoid remains are found throughout Europe and Asia. Secondly, did Europeans of the 15th to 19th centuries rescue the world from tyranny and barbarism? Or did Europe decimate one race, the indigenous American, enslave and disperse another, African, and reduce the third to dependency, Asians, and enrich itself, European whites, in knowledge and material wealth in the process? Was that process one of rescue, as the new defenders of cultural pluralism maintain, or was it one of monumental moral depravity and greed? The history by Europeans of European, quote-unquote discoveries and exploits is a history we now know to be a gross distortion of truth, according to the research of men and women like Houston, Job, Van Sertima, Williams, etc. It is in fact the basis of the white man's and his woman's sense of self and the foundation of their rationale for continued world dominance. The recovery of that historical consciousness among Africans must be given the highest priority. That recovery, however, is more than the simple acquisition of a knowledge of historical facts, something that I talk about here all the time. Yeah, it's cool to talk history, but are you using that history to build a future, right? The facts or truth of African achievement are readily available to all people. Indeed, as Chancellor Williams and other historians before him observed, the basements and warehouses of European museums provided exceptional resources for the study of the material artifacts of African culture. Indeed, the truth of African genius, although denied vehemently by European colonial propagandists, was well known to European American academia. The essence of that historical consciousness for Africans is the will and the ability to personalize that history. The process of identifying oneself or one's family in that history, seeing oneself in that history, and growing out of that history. The consequence of that intimate identification is the development of ways of thinking that are consistent with that history and patterns of behavior that answer the imperatives and dynamics of that history in the most progressive way. The highest manifestation of this historical consciousness corresponds to what Asante calls Afrocentric awareness, the fifth level of personal transformation. It involves the adoption of new criteria for life, where African-centered values and definitions dictate the rhythms of one's life. This new consciousness corresponds in part to Fanon's fighting phase, where the formerly culturally alienated are completely reinculturated in such a way that their identification with their own culture is complete, and their commitment to battle for its existence and development is concretized. In the organizational experience of the Nation House organization, over the last 20 years, the current phase has been identified as the phase of nationalist reconstruction, wherein our organizations or institutions reflect a recovered and revitalized African-centeredness in both their structure and operations, and in their mission and actual productive work. The organizational focus is nation building, not social maintenance. The institutions provide the context for interpersonal relationships, family dynamics, educational processes, and development projects that act in accordance with the heightened need for high moral standards, serious study, self-discipline, and productivity. You know, for some strange reason, and I'm not gonna linger on this, for some strange reason, when you talk about within Black society, even amongst conscious folks, to be frank, when you talk about high moral standards, right, serious study, self-discipline, right, when you talk about those kinds of things, for some reason, folks like to push back against it. And frankly, that's a part of our down. If a conscious person is pushing back against that, then what chance do we have? Right? When conscious folks like myself say, hey, we gotta have more self-discipline, more self-accountability. We gotta have a higher set of moral standards in our community. If conscious folks fight against that, then we have no chance. Right? And I know that those wordings are not as simple as they seem. That is a lot of work that needs to happen, you know, to make those things a reality. But at the same time, if you poo-poo those types of things, those words, those types of concepts, then we're screwed. In the chat room, I see we have Mchaka joined us saying peace. The learning curve with the revolutionary matron says we have to be powerful. KW7 says the United States of America has always been balkanized to favor Urugu. Absolutely. Kevin Kare 42 is here. He says right wing or left wing media, all the same. Two wings on the same filthy diseased bird. He says multicultural society does not benefit Black melanated people. I agree. The divided states of America has never ever been united. Right? The revolutionary matron says to Mchaka, hey nephew, LOL. Right. If you don't know what that hey nephew is referring to, you need to be tuning in to the learning curve with the revolutionary matron, as well as the Pro-Black Perspective podcast, right? Then you'll understand. So peace to Mchaka, thanks for being here. I appreciate it. At least you're not on African time today, huh? Slightly, but not as bad as recently, right? Psychological factor of culture. So this section talks about the psychological factor of culture, the stage of personal transformation that Asante calls personal transformation is similar to what Job calls the psychological factor of culture. It is a description of those cultural, psychic invariants that survive among a people in spite of national or racial domination. That set of behaviors that is unique to Africa has been described by Jope as including cosmological optimism, communalism, and collectivism. We might add the sense of rhythm, song, spontaneous, free-form creativity, and the celebration of the ancestors as continuing members of the family collective, and the central place that intuitive, psychic, or subconscious, vibes, play in personal and collective perceptions. Asa Hilliard has described the cognitive style of Africans as sociocentric, holistic, affective, humanistic, flexible, and expressive. Right? Only time I say might disagree with someone. Again, check out that recent episode and you'll understand the reference. The cognitive style of Africans is unique, but does not limit our ability to process and master knowledge and skills generated by other cultures. The same will be true of other people relative to knowledge acquired from African cultures. The manner in which Africans possess information is a reflection of the unique history of the African world. Those processes are characteristic and invariant because of their antiquity, the consistent socio-historical reinforcement, and the biogenetic adaptations that evolved to accommodate them. So this section is about the spiritual basis of African culture. The psychological factor is in large measure an extension of the spiritual factor. The tradition tells us that the physical form is accentuated by the spirit. Is actuated by the spirit. Spirituality is a critical component in the cultural personality of Africans, as it is historically central to the experiences of Africans wherever they are. Spirituality refers to that real and unknowable domain of existence that occurs contiguous with the material world, precedes it, and is sequent to it. The relationship of the spiritual to the material is interactive and constant. Spirituality is not to be confused with religious dogma, mysticism, or the mythological, dark, and foreboding realm inhabited by demonic, flesh-hungry boogeymen. Spirituality encompasses the celebration of the ancestors. It encompasses the reliance on intuition or vibes to gauge interpersonal relations. Spirituality involves the knowing or intuitive and subconscious awareness of the unity or wholeness of all creation, of ancestor, the living and the unborn. To say that we are a spiritual people is to say that we define and identify ourselves as one with all creation. It is to say that we as individuals and as a people are linked substantively to the collective energy or force or consciousness of all those who have gone before us. It is to say that our physical form is actuated by the metaphysical, spirit. It is to say that in our physical form we can affect the collective metaphysic and be affected by it. That we can physically manifest the collective spiritual consciousness or the consciousness of our individual forebears and actively commune with that consciousness. The concept of spirituality as the core factor in the cultural ethos, the sociocultural identity of African people, is a simple one. The concept is made complex because of our collective tendency, one born of our humiliation and subjugation by Caucasians during the Holocaust of African enslavement, to define ourselves, our history and reality in terms of the Caucasian. The meaning of spirituality for Africans is consistently confused because of the confusion and misalignment of distinct cultural realities. Those conflicting cultural realities are extensions of the circular, holistic cognitive style of Africans and their linear, analytic, and materialist cognitive style of Europeans. That confusion is further compounded because of the power relationship between subordinated and dependent African nationalities and dominant Caucasians of Europe and Asia, and the symbolic forms associated with that power relationship, namely language, rituals, behavioral, and cognitive patterns and associative values. Spirituality concerns itself primarily with one's conception, image, and interaction with the acknowledged primal creative force. Every self-conscious nation, race, or people would identify that creator as a paramount idealization of that people's concept of themselves. If they conceive of their ideal selves as characterized by truth, justice, property, harmony, balance, reciprocity, and order, their self-reflective creator will manifest the same. If they should conceive of themselves as being in competition and conflict with the given natural order, as destined to reconfigure that order and then dominate that transformed order, then their creator will manifest the same unifocal and vengeful character. Every nation, race, or people will find the quintessential source of meaning and being in the will and power of the creative force. That people will be guided and inspired by that paramount power, of which they themselves are in fact an extension and expression. That people will name and interact with that creator in their own language, and will represent that creative force or its intermediary agents in ways very consistent with the character and the culture of the people. So here are some words I might butcher. Niame, Onya Kopon, Inkosi, Oludumare, Katshonde, Ra. The creative force or God in the African cosmology represent the undifferentiated life force or spirit present in all creation. The physical form of the individual person is activated by the spirit, and that spirit is enshrined in that body. That single spirit, the Kra of the Akan and the Ka of Kemet, is simply one differentiated form of the greater God force, and returns to that greater undifferentiated whole upon the expiration of the physical form. Throughout Africa and throughout the African history, we have paid homage to a multitude of deities and ancestors which are uniformly perceived as intermediary agents of the primal and singular creative force. Those deities exist because of the traditionally African recognized need to facilitate human cognition through particularization, structure, and analogy. Comprehension of the whole of the undifferentiated God force is impossible. Particularized according to characteristics and personalized according to local tradition. The imperceptibility of the whole God force was made cognitively manageable. The ancestors whose Kra or Ka departed their bodies upon death remain accessible to the living because the living sustain that nexus or connection of the spiritual form and the physical world through collective and individual ritual. The concept of polytheism among Africans is a bogus conception born of European and Asian ideologists' need to discredit African culture in order to more effectively dominate Africa's people. So that's something I always wondered about. What was it that the Europeans said that made Africans turn away from the various, from their pantheon of deities to deal in the, in so-called monotheism of their colonizer religions? Like, I remember seeing a video of a black woman, black equals African woman, talking about, hey, I'm glad that for the slave trade because it allowed me to meet this Mexican dude, Jesus Christ, right? And she was like, because if it wasn't for that, I would be in Africa somewhere worshiping a tree. So what is it in the colonizers' religion? This is a question for you guys listening to me live or in the playback. What is it in the colonizers' religion that you feel made black equals African people give up on that stuff for this one white deity? And I know some of you might probably say, well, the lake of fire bullshit, that will get people to convert over. But was that really enough in your opinion, was that it? Was that really enough? Arthur is here. Arthur makes a good point. He actually makes a really good point. He said, what did the Europeans say? He said the Africans' gods couldn't protect them from Europeans. They must have thought, what good were they? To counter that, and that's a good thought. I like it. To counter that though, again, like John Henry Clark used to say, slave and master praying to the same God, one to be free of slavery, one to keep his slaves, right? And the one who's praying to keep his slaves kept winning, kept having his prayers answered. So then why would the Africans still follow that God? Right? Why would the ancestors continue to follow the white God who clearly didn't pray, who clearly didn't answer their prayers? Right? The Revolution Matron says the magical thinking has a place and needs to be understood, but we cannot decide that is the only way. Arthur goes on to say religion must have a utility, delivering in the present on the future, preferably in the future. I like that. The Revolution Matron says, 1, you can have as much as me. 2, you can be free. 3, I won't punish you as much. Unending terror and unfounded hope. Hope is a drug that makes you believe the impossible. Arthur says, how can you call someone born in the Middle East, hiding out in Egypt, a European deity? The pro-black perspective says, yeah, I'm developing my reservation on culture talk, but many of them went to Catholic school and such. I'm developing my reservation on culture talk, but many of them went to Catholic school and such. Right, so the Catholic school thing, so there was a time, and still is a time, that Africans do attend Catholic schools or these religious schools, and so they're indoctrinated in those schools. Absolutely. By the way, to the pro-black perspective, if I were you, I would keep talking about culture. In your Sunday broadcasts, did I agree personally with 100% of things said? No. But I damn sure had food for thought in that presentation. And so and it really made me think about like Caribbean culture and how it's really like a feeble pushback against being dominated when you really think about it. So that conversation was good, and I saw some folks discuss some of the things that they thought was popping over, certain things and stuff like that. But that's fine. That's what you want. You want folks to push back a bit and have that dialogue. So to me, it was great. The learning curve says we need that culture. Absolutely. Arthur says definitely the top schools in Africa and the Caribbean generally have a strong religious indoctrination component. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, forget top schools. In the Caribbean, like in government school, I went to government school back home, and there was always a class on religious studies. Always, like all of us had to go through these religious studies classes, and of course it was about Christianity, right? It was about Jesus and that, All right, yeah, but that culture conversation, that's an important conversation to have, right? where was I? I keep forgetting where I was. Huh. So I'm gonna read. I'm gonna read here. Actually, I think I figured it out. The concept of polytheism among Africans is a bogus conception born of European and Asian ideologists' need to discredit African culture in order to more effectively dominate Africa's people. Africa has never been anything other than fully cognizant of the one God force. Indeed, consciousness of the God force began with Africa and matured in Africa before its dispersal to the plains of Asia and caves of Europe. The centrality of the spirituality to the cultural reality of Africans has not limited African mastery of the material world. Indeed, the world's first and best model of spiritual and material mastery was Kemet. Kemet was technologically advanced in geometry, algebra, trigonometry, anatomy, medicine, astronomy, physics, architecture, etc. It was equally, if not more, advanced in its conceptions and practices of spirituality. Kemet did not seek to find the God force in the course of its scientific inquiry. It would have been clear to them that the subatomic particles of the infinite microcosmic world did not provide any special access to the God force. The same is true of the quasars, galaxies, great attractors, etc., of the infinite macrocosmic. Study and mastery of the material world merely facilitates the development of the spirit within us. We, being of the spirit, are like it. We are the source, the product, and the potential, the father, the son, the mother, and daughter, the creator, and created. Just as spirituality is fundamental to our being and thereby our culture, it is also fundamental to our current and historic condition of humiliation and subordination. Our conquest by the marauding armies and commercial agents of non-Africans was facilitated historically and currently by marauding religious proselytizers, evangelists, missionaries, etc. And we maintained our spiritual grounding, our essential cultural integrity could not have been fragmented. Let me read that again. Had we maintained our spiritual grounding, our essential cultural integrity could not have been fragmented. We would have maintained the political and moral will to thwart foreign domination. The foreign armies would have eventually left or died of disease and isolation. The commercial agents would have been forced to offer trade on favorable terms. The non-African quote-unquote religions, however, served to alienate our people from the spiritual foundations. Our linkages with the power and will of the creative force of Onyankopon, Niame, Chuku, Kuyumbi, etc., were not completely severed, but severely constricted by the perversions, the contorted myths, and hidden agendas of non-African quote-unquote religions. It is likely that our material impoverishment and dependency will continue so long as we subordinate ourselves to alien and imperialistic religious concepts. Our collective march toward true liberation and development will begin as we discard the religious shackles of 2 millennia and reassert our connection with and the centrality of the African creator God force, a creator God force to be called by any name that is African. Spirituality in the reconstructed and revitalized cosmology. In fact, before I continue, let me ask this question of you guys listening. What's your preferred name for the creator God force? Right? As most of you being Africans outside of the continent, Africans of the diaspora, right? What name do you prefer for the African God force, right? Spirituality in the reconstructed and revitalized cosmology of the African nationality must take its impetus and substance from the traditional spiritual formations of Africa. Given that material and social and Environments have evolved continually in response to changing conditions. Simple replication of traditional structure would be inappropriate and would likely result in abuse. The essential substance and fundamental assumptions, however, must be at the heart of the spiritual system. Principle among those fundamentals are everyone has a direct linkage to the Creator. Each must find his or her own path. Our ancestors dwell among us and are available to us. That spiritual awareness, connectedness, is a way of life to be celebrated daily in a variety of forms, and the strength of the national collective grows out of its spiritual foundations. This brings us to a section called Functions of Culture. Let me see what's going on in the chat room. In the meantime, Arthur says, we learned all about the travels of Paul. We really get cut off from African history and traditions. That's the chief reason we forsake it. Lack of access and information. You need discipleship. Arthur goes on to say, yeah, man, I knew all about Paul's journeys. I could tell you all those details from before I was 10 years old. Ridiculous waste of brain space and power. All right, amen, right to that. Rico reminds you guys, make sure you hit the like button. Thanks for hitting the like button too. The learning curve calls the African god force the creator. Arthur says creator. Now the question was, what African name do you prefer for the god force? KW Don 7 says Amen Ra. I can get behind that. The pro-black perspective says Amon. I could definitely get behind that. Arthur says, I correct myself when I use an article the in front of creator. I like to preserve a sense of creator being undifferentiated. Okay. Okay. So just creator. Okay. That's fine. All right. Let's continue. So this next section is functions of culture. The several component factors are themselves dynamic and serve to point out the overall dynamic nature of culture. Culture is everything a people does. That everything, however, is an interactive and interrelated composite. Culture defines the parameters within which a people act. People, through their constant interaction with the environment, are constantly shaping their culture. The principal functions of culture include serving as the cement for social and national integration or cohesion. It functions to define the boundaries of thought and behavior that ensure the existence and survival of the nation. In establishing those boundaries, culture prescribes a necessary range of conformity, and conversely, it prescribes appropriate sanctions for those who venture beyond those bounds. The specific functions of culture include the following. A, provides a lens of perception or cognitive framework in which to view the world. B, delineates standards of evaluation by which to measure worth or legitimacy, beauty, and truth. C, defines the conditions and or means that motivate or stimulate a member, be it institutional and individual, of society, and prescribes sanctions for disruptive digression. D, defines collective and individual identity roles and responsibilities. E, provides a common language or means of communication. F, provides the basis for social organization. G, conditions the mode of production. H, defines the national identity and mission. I, delineates a process for perpetuation of the culture. So one thing, and this was on my mind on Sunday. One of the things you have to understand too with culture if you're not guarding culture, a lot of attributes of culture gets lost. For example, a person from Barbados who's a 20-something-year-old today has a lot of cultural differences from another Barbadian or Bayesian from 100 years ago. So to look at a culture today and to assume that that's how it's always been, to me, is a problem. And that's something I want people to understand, right? The culture will continue, but it will change with time, especially when you're being inundated with outsiders, etc., around your culture, right? To continue. And in fact, you don't even have to have outsiders. Just new people have new outlooks. So new people, by that I mean people born into a culture, there's certain things that they will feel in time that serves them and that doesn't serve them, and they'll get rid of it. You know? So like, for example, when Oni was showing the video in Sunday's episode, those young hunter-gatherers were like, the moon? You know, we don't really think about the moon like that. But their ancestors probably did. Their ancestors probably had a deep thought about the moon, but these guys are new guys on the scene. They're like, the moon? Shit. That bright light that's messing with my ability to hunt? You know what I mean? So that's something to keep in mind about culture. These functions are fulfilled as the people, the nation, responds institutionally or collectively to its environment. Those institutions that evolve from the people's historical experience provide for stability and clarity and facilitate the orderly intergenerational transmission of that culture. So now we get to the section called Nation Building as Re-Africanization. Nation Building as Re-Africanization. Let me check the chat and see what's going on. Arthur asks an excellent question. And I'll get to that in a second. Dorico says, Amen Ra, because they saying amen after every prayer anyway, but they don't know why. Yep. The matron says, everyone needs to see that Sunday show at the Pro-Black Perspective. This affirms that conversation. Arthur says, if culture is dynamic, what are we talking about when we try to return to African culture? Now, that's an excellent question. That's an excellent question. The history, right? History will get us back to some point in African culture. Like I said, if you talk to and you know, it depends. You have to go through the history, like I said. If you talk to a 20-something-year-old African today, you might not get much from them as far as African culture, besides, you know, how they prepare a certain rice dish or something like that, right? But if you go through if you go backwards through the generations, you know, you'll be able to put together, you know, larger and larger pictures of what traditional African culture looked like. And the reality of it is, to be quite frank with you, we ain't really trying to go back to African culture from 2,000 years ago. The reality of it is, what we're trying to do is we're trying to immerse ourselves really in what's going on in the continent today, in reflection of what has gone on in the past on the continent, right? We're trying to build a future, and frankly, we're trying to really build upon, right, or further a future African culture in reality. Like in reality, well, maybe I shouldn't say that, but like the pro-black perspective says, hold on a second. Some jackass started blasting gospel music. I don't know if you guys can hear that. But the pro-black perspective says them hunters were wild. Meat, LOL, but that's normal when you feed yourself, right? But African culture, we just try, you know, really and truly, we need to kind of build that ourselves. I like the crux of what the pro-black perspective was saying on Sunday. We got to start working on an economy, an African economy, to really start talking about African culture. You feel me? To continue. So nation building as re-Africanization. Nation building, finally, is a systematic and sustained effort to reconstruct the national culture in all of its dimensions. That effort must begin with the reconstitution of the historical nucleus, the fuel core of culture, whose dynamism radiates outward and energizes and defines the language, symbols, institutions, and state apparatus of the national culture. This effort or process corresponds to what Cabral calls re-Africanization and entails the reconstruction and rehabilitation of the historical continuum and historical consciousness that was aborted during the Holocaust of African enslavement. This nation-building re-Africanization process must necessarily follow the outlines of the cultural sphere elaborated earlier. It would entail three basic overlapping stages, including A, rediscovery, historical recovery, which is what I was getting at a second ago. B, redefinition, cultural reaffirmation, right? Redefinition or cultural reaffirmation. And C, revitalization or national liberation. It must begin, as indeed it already has, with the systematic exhumation and revivification of African history throughout the continent and the diaspora from antiquity to the contemporary. The first stage must include the recovery and revitalization of the core values of antiquity, particularly as represented in the sacred works, philosophy, language, and other symbolic forms. The linkage with the civilizations of ancient Kush and Kemet are critical to the entire African historical continuum. It is equally important that the simultaneous effort to recover and revitalize the core values of the surviving traditional societies be maintained. So that again, everything I read in this section is really like reinforcing the point I was trying to make to Arthur's question, right? You're gonna have to go through the history, right, and try to recover what was happening long ago that's still surviving today, and that's and in that way you're gonna have to reconstruct an African culture, right? If you look at what's going on, just a side note, if you look at African culture today, or you look at Caribbean culture, what is it really? It's really just a response to the situation of colonization. That's really what it is. As a Bahamian now, if I talk to someone who was a Bahamian 100 years ago, right, which they weren't even called a Bahamian 100 years ago, funny enough, right? But if I spoke to that person, our culture will be, what I understand as Bahamian culture versus what they understood is different, So all we can do is go back through the history and pull out the things that you still see today. that's still intact today. Try to, along the way, try to rediscover, the things that will help us as opposed to harm us, right? The revolutionary major says we got to go to Africa with respect for the past and an economy that will last generations. That is Pan-Africanism. And that's really what we're getting at too, right? Pan-Africanism, oftentimes we talk about Pan-Africanism as just like this unity and this understanding. But the reality of it is Pan-Africanism really needs to be an economy, right? And from that economy, from that trading back and forth, from that dealing with each other across oceans and whatnot, we can connect this concept of culture. We can reconnect and revitalize the parts of African quote-unquote culture that still remains and that still lives on in the Caribbean, in the Americas, et cetera, right? It is equally important that the simultaneous effort to recover and revitalize the core values of the surviving traditional society be maintained, as many of those societies can trace their formation and evolution directly to Kemet, or at least to the same seminal African cultural formation of antiquity. Much of the work involved in this effort will involve stripping away the perverse influence of Asian and European cultural invasions. You see what I'm saying? And the losses due to neglect and alienation. Many of the values and social formations will be similar, if not the same as Kemet. It is nonetheless crucial that actual physical linkages be reestablished and maintained, that wherever possible, the traditional formations be rescued and adapted to modern times. So this is what the matron was talking about. It's crucial that actual physical linkages be reestablished, right? This is what we have to do. There's a lot of work to do, man, and I think because there's so much work to do, that's why we can't get our folks together. I think folks realize, man, there's so much work to do. A lot of it has to be done simultaneously. And I think a lot of our folks just feel like, man, let me stay with my head in the bubble. I make enough dough, I could run to the Chinese shop on the corner and buy a fried rice and a sweet drink, as we say back home, and I'm good. All that work y'all talking about, and I think I truly believe within me that's a big part of the problem. It's kind of cool for a lot of us, or at least a lot of us feel it's cool to be up on the white mama and papa, right? Because they doing all this work, but the thing is, the work that they're doing still doesn't really benefit. The process of historical reconstruction will facilitate a method and standard by which to identify and evaluate those values and behaviors acquired during this period of generalized and endemic cultural and political and economic anarchy. That is the legacy of the Holocaust. The object of this effort is to firmly establish the historical cultural continuity from Kush, Kemet, through traditional societies to now. This process of evaluation of contemporary behaviors and values necessitates the elaboration of an African world ideology. The cultural and nationalist tradition as well is well represented in modern times by leaders like Martin Delany, Marcus Garvey, the men and women of the UNIA, Lumumba, Malcolm X, Joe, and countless others. The tradition of activism and study has provided the basis for the formation of a comprehensive and coherent African ideology. That ideology is critical for the development of the institutional and physical infrastructure that will ensure the strength, permanence, and continued development of a truly African-centered nationality, firmly fixed within a revitalized African historical continuum. This African world ideology will will occasion the formation of a world organization of African peoples of the kind called for by Chancellor Williams, lately by Chinwezu, but anticipated by Henry Garnett, Martin Delany, Bishop Henry McNeill Turner, W.E.B. Du Bois, and predicated on the work of Marcus Garvey. The evaluation of contemporary behaviors and values also implies that some acquired behaviors and values must be abandoned. Is what I said. It's, you know, there's some editing that needs to be done. All right? Keep the things that serve us and get rid of what doesn't serve us. You know, like for example, and I hate to beat a dead horse, but again, I go back to that video with the African in Rwanda getting beat by the Asian guy. When I posted that to Discord, one of the brethren on the Discord said, well, you know, Africans historically don't like violence. Well, guess what? If a man put his hand on you, send him to the grave. I don't care what we talking about. I don't care who controls the industry and all this old shit. If as a man standing up to another man, if he puts his hands on you, you take him out. We got to get rid of some of that old foolish behavior that we had in the past. It doesn't serve us now, right? It doesn't serve us now, right? A strong, comprehensive, and independent educational base, along with control and ownership of media, print and electronic, study groups, and cultural arts associations and institutions is critical to advancing and sustaining new African-centered behaviors. The population, particularly the youth, must be convinced that those behaviors that are a consequence of our forced estrangement from our own culture and which are adverse to the interests of the new nationality must be and can be abandoned. You were on with the matron and Magi commander, I believe that was last night. The Harsh Reality podcast, D Webb popped on, and one of the things he talked about is like, you can't really work with 35-plus-year-olds now. You have to be focused on the youth now, and I have to somewhat agree with that. The problem is, though, is the 35-plus-year-olds are the ones with the children. So somehow you have to wrestle these children away from these adults and change their destiny. And that's going to be, you know, in fact, if I remember, the Harsh Reality podcast mentioned Keprel and MCS, the MCS organization. I once interviewed Keprel on the show, right? And he was talking about how, like, they were working with these youths and stuff like that, and they had to fight up with the parents. Like, they had this organization, they were picking up kids and training them in different ways and teaching them different things, and they had to fight up with the parents oftentimes. You know, so that's really the challenge that we have. We have to get to the youth, right? Arthur says, yes, the work is intimidating. He says the payoff seems so far in the future. But you see, Arthur, that's our problem right there. Most of us have this mentality, if I can't see it in my lifetime, then why should I be bothered with it? You know, that's one of the underlying problems with, like, climate change and trying to actually work to fix it. Folks are saying, oh, well, when the Earth's atmosphere ignites into a fireball, I'll be long dead by that time. Well, then what about your lineage? So it shows a total disregard. And by the way, that's not black folks saying that, that's white folks saying that shit about climate change. But we have to start seeing it like, listen, we might not see the promised land, but we could do the work to get our people to it, though. And we gotta take pride in that. We have to take pride in it. Arthur also says a strong, comprehensive, and independent educational base. See it there? That is the start. That's absolutely the start. This is why I'm reading this. I'm reading this because I've talked about it, this education thing, for a long time, and I don't think a lot of folks are getting it and getting the ties between education, particularly primary education, to nation building. Right? A lot of our folks aren't getting it. Right? And our enemies, they got this a long time ago. Our enemies got this like 500 years ago. Right? A priority of all the institutions within the African Centered community must be the rehabilitation of the family. Independent community-based institutions must see themselves as extensions of the family. Effective parenting within a viable family, which family is also supported within a supportive network of families, is a central requirement for the perpetuation of those new African-centered values among the youth. This network of families and institutions must seek to channel the development of the young and rescue those who might be led astray by the propaganda of non-African cultural political formations. The third stage of the re-Africanization or nation-building process includes the creative and directed fusion of tradition and modernity. The fusion is guided by the principles and priorities of an African world ideology and is consistent with the imperatives of African history and culture. That fusion must reflect the values fundamental to the African historical continuum, and at the same time possess the capacity to function effectively in the modern international arena. So this is the conclusion for this part of the book. It says our mission as institutions and as a people is multifaceted. We must first clear away the cloak of confusion and distortion that has obscured the historical continuum of African people of the African nationality. In the course of study and work of bonding and building, we have to identify the essential truths and dynamics of that continuum, screening out the distortions, the perversions that were either imposed on us during the 3 millennia of foreign conquest and domination, or which were adopted in our confusion and ignorance of the way of our ancestors. We must also remain conscious that culture is dynamic. It is not a fixed phenomenon. There are internal dynamics that may lead to a constructive division and replication. There are also dynamics that are external to our own national culture, which we must anticipate and to which we must adjust. Cultures interact in ways that involve mutual enrichment, a sort of intercultural orbit and interaction. In this instance, each cultural entity maintains its distinct identity, but contributes to a truly democratic and pluralistic world order characterized by mutual respect. The encounter of different cultures may involve violent collision, resulting in a new reality of the progressive depletion, exploitation, and distortion of the weaker culture. This latter scenario has been the condition of the African nationality in the era of Eurocentric cultural hegemony. This is a scenario that we must reorder, in which Europeans, their white American siblings, and their colored adjuncts will forcefully resist. I love that. I love how he put that just now. All right? The future of the world is pluralism, a mutual cooperation of different world cultures. Our first and foremost priority, however, is to reconstitute and revitalize our national cultural identity. We must reestablish the historical consciousness that defines us. We must strengthen the spiritual linkages with our ancestors and each other. We must build this nation, this nationality, because our lives, our unique consciousness and capabilities, our very distinctive cultural reality, and that of our children depend on our continuing success in this nation building process. All right? That's only facts right there. All right? That's what we have to be on. So the next part of the paper, and these are all the resources, footnotes, etc. The next part of the paper is Afrikan Centered Education. Let me see what the comments are saying. In the meantime, Arthur says, part of our indoctrination is to disregard the infinite value of our life. So we slaughter each other in the streets. So to value a possible future, that's a stretch we must make. Absolutely. Absolutely. The average youth that we have out here slaughtering each other in the streets, if you look at their educational history, they were done with school like by grade 3. If they got past grade 3, they were done by grade 6. All right? That school to prison pipeline, that's a primary education problem. More so than a secondary one, right? Most of the people I knew back home who was on bad man business, they kind of checked out either in grade 3, grade 6, and definitely by grade 9, they were done. You ain't seeing them in no school no more. That's just the reality of Form 3 for those familiar with the British system as it is, right? That's just the reality. Those 3 levels is where you start to see the dwindling of black youth. This is where you start to see the teenage pregnancies between grade 6 and 9, right? And so the folks in the hoods, or in the streets as they call it, that you and I typically don't want to even really be involved with, to be quite frank, right? That stuff comes from a failure in education starting typically around grade 3. And that's something we have to address. If we want to save those guys from falling into the foolishness, we got to get at them really by grade 3. Whatever age grade 3 is, we have to get to them by that time, right? Let me do a quick station ID break. On the other side, I'll come back and we will read the section of the book called Afrikan Centered Education. I'll be right back.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the revolutionary matron on KWAZ Radio. Have you ever considered joining KWAZ Radio? Each of our hosts shares their unique perspective with you. You might have a perspective that needs to be shared. If that's true, hit us up at kwaz.radio@gmail.com. What are you gonna do? What you gonna do?
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. You guys make sure to check out all of those shows, all the content from all of those shows on KWAZ Radio. And if you think you have a voice that should be heard, you have a message or a thought, right, that can be developed into a podcast, and you can do that regularly, reach out to KWAZ Radio at kwaz.radio@gmail.com. Right? We're trying to grow the number of shows that we have on here. Right now we're doing real dope though. The Learning Curve, real dope. Pro Black Perspective, Harsh Reality Podcast, all on point. So we're trying to add other shows with, that have different niches, etc. So, if you think that's you, just hit them up and let them know, and I know I personally, and I'm sure everyone else, will welcome you to the fold. Right? So to continue with the reading, and by the way, thank you guys for being here. I really do appreciate you guys being here with me. So thank you for that. Let's continue reading until about 10 o'clock. Okay, so Afrikan Centered Education. People rise and fall within the context of the nation institution. When they lose the ability to master and control the nation institution, they lose their freedom. This is where we are. A nation within a nation, searching for the concept of a nation. So I think Onita Say put it best. In America, black folks are really just a population. There's really no nationhood amongst black folks in America. Right? So you're just a population within a nation, searching for the concept of nation. Right? That's how I would amend it. Education is the ritualized reaffirmation of the national identity. It is anchored in the real and idealized history of a people. The nation's education is shaped and given impetus by the cultural and ideological assumptions, dynamics, essential values, priorities, and goals of the nation. Education, formal and informal, lies at the very core of the nation, as it involves the codification, perpetuation, interpretation, and transmission of the national history and culture, which history and culture are the fundamental building blocks and cohesive force of the nation. For Africans at this juncture in history, the issues of culture and identity must supersede all other concerns. Issue of identity, collective or national, and the personal identity that flows out of the collective is fundamental. The issues are fundamental because the essence of our Africanity, of our unique cultural spiritual identity, is being eroded by the relentless thrust of alien religious and ideological proselytization, the propaganda of non-African centered media, and the cultural and political demands of foreign domination centers of finance. The gravest consequence of African enslavement and humiliation has been the inculcated willingness of our people to abandon the essence of our identity. That essence includes our sense of spirituality, the conception of our origins and nature of our being. It includes our historical and culturally determined values, our outlook and behaviors. In so doing, successive generations of Africans have unwittingly relegated our cultural heritage, our unique sense of the world, our ancestors' legacy, and our children's future to an inferiorized status. Like Kemet, under the imperialist weight of Rome, we have become a population whose destiny is determined by the political whims and economic needs of quote-unquote superior civilizations. This process of inferiorization has assumed unparalleled prominence in the lives of all African people, both in the diaspora and on the continent. Its historical origins can be traced to the period in which Africa was, quote, penetrated and dominated, end of quote, by Asians and Europeans. This process of inferiorization is a direct consequence of that penetration and domination. It is characterized chiefly by the concept of the superiority of European American and Asian, in parentheses, Arabic, culture or civilization. This sense of white superiority and African inferiority has assumed a tragic prevalence in the conscious and subconscious minds of Africans. Both on the continent and in the diaspora, our people's sense of value is directly determined by Eurocentric agencies of certification and validation. Our leaders cannot lead unless they have been validated by the white-dominated popular media. Our systems of governing are judged primitive unless they are properly validated replicas of the white Western governments. our sense of physical beauty frequently amounts to no more than a slavish imitation of a caucasized department store mannequin. Damn. That have little or no precedent or relation to African culture or physiology. We have an abundance of bleaching creams and hair relaxers in villages where there is no running water or electricity. Let me say that one more time. We have an abundance of bleaching creams and hair relaxers in villages where there is no running water or electricity. In the diaspora, the most prominent business entrepreneurs have acquired their fortunes through schemes that exploited African self-hatred and the attendant physical disfigurement. We risk cancer, physical disfigurement, the disrespect of our children, and the disdain of culturally self-conscious nations of the world as we race along in ape-like bliss toward the abyss of cultural alienation, racial oblivion. You guys drop a 1 in the chat if you like what you've been hearing so far from this book. Drop a 1 in the chat if you like what you're hearing so far in the book. Shabagi E is here. I'm glad to see Shabagi E came back. Shabagi E says, good evening, nice show. Just for the record, I don't mind being challenged. Feel free to question me and my source of information. All I ask is that my voice be heard. Now, your voice is heard for sure. Now, you do post a lot of comments, and so sometimes, depending on the conversation, it might be hard to get to every one of them, but in a show like tonight, I'll get to all of them. Shabagi E also says in the Kemetic tradition, there's no such thing as ancient. That is a Eurocentric or Western view of the world. I think he meant that. When you talk about our tradition, let me remind you, a body of knowledge are still incontinent as respect, wanting to expose this wisdom with the public. This is what I'm trying to explain, because they are trying to expose this tradition. That's why we are initiating people who are ready to be part of the Kemetic way of life. Okay. The matron says this behavior is enraging. And I got a couple of number 1s from Rico Cooper Photography, Ath Reserve. By the way, y'all guys check out Ath Reserve's music. Check out his music. KW Don 7 types 1 as well. So you guys are enjoying what you're hearing, and I appreciate the fact that you guys are enjoying it as well. All right. So we had this section of the paper called Inferiorization. Process of inferiorization is accomplished primarily through the agency of formal education or formal indoctrination, not through armed might, but through non-African or alien culturally centered educational systems, including the philosophy, the pedagogy, and the curriculum. It is further facilitated by the religious proselytization, electronic media, propaganda, and financial thrust mentioned above. This is why, side note, this is why we have a KWAZ radio. And this is why we try to get similarly minded folks who believe in nation building, right? Folks who believe in the re-education of African people. This is what we're doing here, right? And this is why I always ask for you guys to support the other shows, because when you listen to my show, for example, you will hear me talk about something that was discussed on the Pro-Black Perspective on the Revolutionary Matrons show, The Learning Curve, or the Harsh Ali podcast. It's an interconnected type thing where you're gonna get knowledge, right? And so we are trying to be, this culturally centered educational system of sorts, or this culturally centered media, to be more specific, right? So this is why you gotta check out all the other shows on the network, right? Keep up with the other shows. Trust me, it's worth it. To continue, it is further facilitated by the religious proselytization, electronic media, propaganda, and financial thrusts mentioned above. This process is one of cultural diffusion that functions to minimize and dismiss the imperatives of African culture and identity, and substitute the imperatives and parameters of alien cultural formations, usually European, American, or Arabic. This process of inferiorization and substitution determines the choices we make at the personal and collective level, as it determines the design and priorities of our institutions and shapes the character of the governments we design to further and protect our national interests. A non-African centered education among Africans is effectively a de-Africanization and indoctrination procedure that serves to condition the African person to assume his or her place in a Caucasoid-dominated, quote-unquote, global village, where the content, form, and implementation of the education of a people is controlled by another people. That education serves no other purpose than the subordination of the less powerful group and maintenance of control. And I knew this was coming. I knew it was coming. I just didn't remember where, but this page is flipped. So of course I'm gonna have to deal with the drama of rotating it a couple of times, which I hate. Yeah. Right. Education employed in this way is simply indoctrination and is the preferred tool of war for the conquering group to maintain the compliance and subservience of the vanquished group. Education is employed in this way is simply indoctrination and is the preferred tool of war for the conquering group to maintain the compliance and subservience of the vanquished group. Here's the thing. Here's the thing I can tell you about our situation. If you don't have it in you to go to war against the education that they give you, right? If you don't have the belly to go to war against education, I damn sure know you ain't gonna be willing to go to war when it actually involves bloodshed. And that's what's so tough for me about our situation. These folks don't really have to bust a, they don't really have to bust a burner out here. All they gotta do is slide you that curriculum. If you're not willing to go to war against this negative instructions that they're giving us and our children, then I damn sure know, especially with the education that you're getting, you damn sure ain't gonna bear no arms. You damn sure ain't gonna bear no arms. See, the key to the thing about war that people don't get to is you try to minimize casualties. So you have different strategies for that. So their preferred method of war is through education. And we ain't willing to put up that fight. Nowhere is this principle more graphically demonstrated than in the relationship of European colonialists to Africans throughout the colonial period, a period of enslavement and colonialism, and currently during this period of nominal African independence and chronic underdevelopment. During the Holocaust of African enslavement, white slaveholders routinely demanded more, infinitely more, from their slaves than labor to assure a sense of duty and servility. The enslaved had to be convinced that their owners were all-knowing, all-merciful, and all-powerful. Consequently, slaves were bombarded with words and deeds telling them they sprang from savages and could be nothing but slaves. Enslavers reasoned correctly that any people believing these tenets would be loyal and grateful to those guiding them through their hopeless existence. That's what the matron talked about, hope, the drug of hope. But I want to point out something here too. And I wish I had it queued up to show it, but anytime there's some fight or something that breaks out in a McDonald's with some high school kids, some black high school kids, notice what the headlines always say. Something synonymous with savages, right? When some dudes from the streets do some dumb shit in the streets, notice what the headlines and what even the common white folks say, right? Savages, right? That's a part of their education, and they know how to use it effectively against our own people. To the point where some of our own people will read those headlines and say, "Yup, bunch of savages out here." In fact, what's homegirl name? Meg Thee Stallion had a whole song talking about she's a savage. A whole song talking about she's a savage. In more recent history, we find an elaboration of the same methods and the nature of the transfer of power from the European colonial powers to the nominally independent nations of Africa. That transfer was occasioned by the wholesale and uncritical adoption by African leadership of European state structures and economic practices and their attendant values, cultural priorities, educational systems, and languages. This is where we fucked up. This is where we messed up. And every year, and this goes back to the culture talk that the Pro-Black Perspective had on Sunday, every year, you know, this goes back to my thoughts during that presentation. Every year we big up Independence Day, right? Every year we big that up. But in reality, all we're doing is celebrating the transfer, right, of power, right, from whiteface to blackface. The European powers trusted that the prominence of their languages, the thoroughly Europeanized cultural interests of the native elite, the monocultural nature of their economies, the Eurocentric nature of the school systems would guarantee that European economic and political interests would be protected in their absence. Thank you for doing the work. So you're still a slave, but you're still doing all the work for us. They were proven correct in that assumption. Trading patterns have remained the same. France, for example, continues to involve itself militarily in the affairs of its former colonies, Chad, Central African Republic, Rwanda. Cultural ties have remained strong in each of the former Francophone, Anglophone, and Lusophone countries, where the colonial languages are still the official languages. Ain't that a damn shame, too? Job has eloquently pointed out that no factor can be more culturally alienated than education in the language of the conqueror. Formal education in Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Ghana, Jamaica, Senegal, Brazil, and Washington, D.C. is conducted in the colonial language by African instructors in European garb, steeped in European mythology, programmed to confuse, to link the soul and psyche of Africans in subservience to that of the European. Carter G. Woodson observed the same phenomena in late 19th and early 20th century in the poignant statement, "Negro educators of today may have more sympathy and interest in the race than the whites now exploiting Negro institutions as educators, but the former have no more vision than our competitors. A Negro teacher instructing Negro children is in many respects a white teacher, thus engaged, for the program in each case is about the same. Right? You could swap in the white guy, swap out the white guy, swap in the black guy. It's the same shit. It's the same shit. So this brings us to cultural and historical basis of education. Education is by definition culturally referenced. Education, in its truest form, is indistinguishable from the process of enculturation. Education in its narrow form, schooling, requires a cultural context in which academic content acquires meaning. Analytical skills require some social or natural phenomena to be effective, which phenomena is invariably perceived culturally. Education is culturally determined, but is specifically responsive to the state, that is, the organized center of the national culture. Formal educational systems are integral organs of the nation state and of the cultural ethos that engenders that state. Those systems serve to perpetuate that culture, the government, and the economic and and political order. All right, let me fix this real quick. I hate that I have to do that. All right. The educational system will not only promote the essential themes of the national culture, but will advance the essential tenets of the dominant ideology. For example, where the nation's genesis is permeated with genocide, white supremacy, racism, etc., the character and structure of the educational process will reflect that genesis. African Centered Education is rooted in the unique history and evolved culture of African people. It is defined in its singular commitment to the elucidation of that history, that culture, and the confirmation, invigoration, and perpetuation of the African collective identity that emanates from that history and culture. African-centered education is concerned with the origins, current status, and future of the African world. Let me read that again for you. African-centered education is concerned with the origins, current status, and future of the African world. African-centered education is committed to correcting the historical distortions born of 3 millennia of foreign invasion, destruction, enslavement, physical and mental colonialism, cultural disruption, and dependency. African-centered education is committed to rooting or anchoring the spiritual and intellectual energies of African people in the spiritual, moral, and philosophical traditions of Africa. African-centered education, whether in the several nations of the diaspora or on the motherland, is concerned to fully develop the sense of African nationality within a border of Pan-African world. African-centered education is concerned to sever irrevocably the pathological and slavish linkage of Africans to the European or Asian ethos. African-centered education is concerned to enable the African person with nation building, nation management, and nation maintenance abilities. Let's read that again. All right? This author, Akoto, is spitting fire here. All right? African-centered education is concerned to enable the African person with nation building, nation management, and nation maintenance abilities. If you listen to, again, if you listen to The Learning Curve or the Pro-Black Perspective or the Harsh Reality Podcast, in recent episodes of those shows, you've heard them talking about this too, right? D. Webb was talking about you go and you get you a trade right now, right? That's something that's going to be necessary and needed if you're talking about nation building, right? Like I've always said, when I started focusing the podcast on African Centered Education efforts. One of the problems that we have is we're not forward thinking in that, listen, you want to talk about going back to Africa, you need to be going back there with some skill. I've listened to certain grifters talk about how come the Africans ain't bringing us back there and giving us land and all this old shit. They're not giving land to their own people. But if you go with a skill that the nation that you land in can use, which is why you need to be forward looking, right? If you're going to go back to the continent, look at where you're going. What do they need? And go there boot ready to provide them with what they need, right? This is what you got to do. This brings us to a section called Historical and Ideological Currents. Before I read it, let me check in with the chat room. Okay, I gotta scroll up because there's been some activity in here. KW Don 7 says, Amos Wilson taught that Yoruba will call you savage to justify treating you savagely. I mean, of course. Absolutely. Right? And that savage thing really is a projection. I mean, all of us in here know by now who's the real savage. Right? The matron says they do what they do to children, but we the bad people. Ape affairs. Assault of pre-K. And something else. I don't know what the remainder was. KW7 says France won't leave their former colonies alone unless they are forced to militarily. I mean, why would they leave them alone? Right? France knows they have, you know, an efficient, well, a decent military. They know they have allies. Right? Why would they leave them alone? It's for Africans to strengthen up themselves, get their minds right, and tell the French to kick rocks, and then be ready to put up fisticuffs after you do it. You know, that's going to be a battle, and you have to be really prepared for that. Shabaga E says indoctrination. Yes, sir. You are right. What is it about the African traditional system that they're scared of? Why is it that the Catholic Church and the Pope incorporate comedics, a belief in the institution, while teaching us to disregard everything about this culture? I agree with what you're saying there. Shabaga E is correct. These guys in the Catholicism and all that bullshit, they have so many African artifacts, African symbolism. Why is that? Right? What are they trying to achieve? Right? What are they trying really to steal? Right? But meanwhile, they'll tell you that your African spirituality was not to be followed, not to be continued. Right? Shabagi says, as you know, the Hindu, Arabs, and the Catholic use Amen in the end of prayers. Absolutely. Which they know very little about, at least some of them. Are we to believe that our answers to picking, as they paint it, as they paint it out to be, I guess. This is the question one have to ask if self-knowledge is the key. We must not always question our tradition and the belief system, but question theirs as well. No, we absolutely have to question theirs as well. Right? We have to study them too. You have to study your enemy. Because trust me, our enemies are studying us and have studied us. Athrazer says, glad I stopped by. I'm glad you stopped by too. Right? Make sure you hit a like button if it's the case that you intend to leave. Shabaga E says, for an example, when the Roman generals ruled Kemet, they started destroying the holographic inscription. Let me tell you, in Greek, this means holy inscription. Ask yourself, what frame of mind or humans go out to destroy holy inscription? Right. So let's continue. Historical and ideological currents. The future of the African world must begin with a confirmed sense of African nationality, defined within the universe of African spiritual, moral, and philosophical traditions, and committed to the material and spiritual development and independence of the African world. Only an unambiguously African-centered education can possibly accomplish this goal. African-centered education is to be distinguished from the current educational philosophies being employed in independent African nations and national enclaves in the Americas, Asia, the Pacific, and Europe. African-centered education rejects the implicit and explicit superiority of European and Asian intellectual, political, and spiritual traditions that characterize the systems of former colonies, dependencies, and slave populations of the African world. It rejects the false historical notion that Asian, in parentheses Arabic, and European civilizations rescued Africans from barbarism and godlessness. African-centered education seeks to restore the traditions of Africa to prominence, to revitalize those traditions and imbue them with the liberating and progressive dynamics of nation building. The current developments in African-centered education are extensions of the efforts undertaken in this country and throughout the African diaspora in the 17th and 18th centuries by the Prince Halls, the Richard Islands, and the countless nameless heroes and heroines who stole off in the late evening to learn to read and compute by moonlight under the constant threat of mutilation and death. These early efforts of Africans in the diaspora were reflective of their awareness of both their Africanity and their separateness from the ruling elite and dominant Eurocentric culture of the Americas. The philosophical, practical currents in the education of Africans have paralleled the ideological sentiments of the African population as projected in their constant resistance and as expressed by their chosen leadership. The initial response of Africans to the horrors of enslavement, the Middle Passage, and the attempted dehumanization can be best characterized as a nascent Pan-Africanism. This will to resist among enslaved Africans in the Americas was evidenced. I just lost where I was. Was evidenced by the efforts of the new arrivals to maintain their sanity and their humanity through the maintenance of the traditions of their homelands. The efforts at resistance are evident in the nation-building efforts of the Maroons, Palmares, Dessalines of Haiti, the outliers of the North American swamplands, Vesey, Prosser, and countless others. The ideological sentiment of Africans in this country varied in general according to the status of Africans relative to the evolving American nation state. Those sentiments are reflected in the African reaction to colonial and early American legislation to restrict the status of chattel slavery exclusively to Africans. It was further reflected in alliances with Amerindians in flight and armed resistance. It was reflected in the African response to the irony of the American quote-unquote founding fathers' rhetoric of liberty and justice for all. The ideological sentiment of Africans was expressed in legal petition, temporary alliances with the French and Spanish, pursuit of repatriation, and countless acts of resistance and rebellion. There were, of course, several ideological currents within the African community. Hold on one second. One or another achieving greater prominence at different times. Each ideological current carried with it a set of basic assumptions about the status of Africans in the white-dominated American political economy, as well as a set of socio-political and economic goals. Those assumptions and goals directly influence the sentiment and expectations of Africans regarding the education available to them, and impacted on the philosophy, design, and implementation of African education. Those ideological currents were never exclusive of one another. They are analogous to a quilt, where one pattern might be dominant at a particular point in the process of completing the whole creation. The several ideological currents must be seen as the varied responses of a people who had been physically vanquished in a war which destroyed their civilization, and where the dominant power sought to subjugate them both psychologically and spiritually. In a very real sense, that war continues today. Indeed, it is the analogy of war and the objects of stratagems of that war which are most instructive in distinguishing the contemporary ideological currents. So that brings me to this section called Forged Unity of Pre-Existent Nationalities. Before I read this section, Forged Unity of Pre-Existing Nationalities, let me check in with the chat. And there's nothing going on in the chat, so I'll go back to the read. I think I'm going to make this the last section I read. If not, I'll read until 10, and then we'll pick up next week, Tuesday, wherever I left off today. The seminal ideology of Africans in diaspora had its beginnings in the holding pens of slave houses on the slave coast of Africa, the quote-unquote slave coast of Africa, the Elminas and the Goree Islands. Those pens and, quote, the slave ships were the first real incubators of slave unity across cultural lines. Cruelty revealing irreducible links from one ethnic group to the other, fostering resistance thousands of miles before the shores of the new land appeared on the horizon. This seminal ideology of Africans in America is best termed the forged unity of pre-existent nationalities. This forged unity carried with it clear and unambiguous conceptions of the relationships of the African reality to the European American. The relationship was one of enduring warfare, of physical, psychological, and spiritual resistance. This seminal ideology was very much nationalist and Pan-Africanist in sentiment. Its impact educationally can be seen in the persistent transmission of the communal spirit in the face of brutal beatings, maiming, separation, incarceration, and murder. The major concepts of that ideology include traditional spirituality, racial allegiance, traditional customs and morality, national resistance, and the inevitable vindication and victory of the race. These concepts were preserved and transmitted from generation to generation. The direct linkage with the continent was preserved in places like South Carolina. The slave trade continued up to the outbreak of the Civil War. This ongoing trade provided an unbroken infusion of feelings and visions of national integrity and freedom. This continual infusion, though a tragic reminder of the dominance and cruelty of the white slaveholders, served nonetheless to keep alive the visions of freedom and nationhood. The will of Africans to resist enslavement physically was never broken or was evident in the countless acts of arson, poisoning, appropriation of slaveholder property, destruction of tools, work slowdowns, feigned ignorance, secrecy, physical attacks, escape, and collective insurgency. The slaveocracy responded to the physical resistance of Africans by tightening controls governing them, limiting certain personal liberties, keeping closer surveillance, promoting slave collaborators through the provision of rewards, enlarging the class of slave catchers and slave breakers, increased threats and actual sales to break up families. South Carolina actually legislated state compensation for the incarceration of or execution of quote-unquote bad slaves. Though the physical war was one-sided, the enslaved Africans fought even more valiantly on the psychological front. So this is an excerpt here. The steadfastness and resourcefulness of slaves in the battle to free themselves psychologically as much as possibly from the totality of their master's control has never been fully told. This stems most likely from the arena in which that struggle occurred. It was fought largely on a psychological battleground where ideas burrowed deep and stayed entrenched despite the onslaught of enemy advances. More important, in all the varied campaigns between these contestants, that mental war front never toppled, for it was there and only there that black combatants could usually win. Racial unity, national integrity, national resistance, cultural awareness, self-reliance, and faith in the ultimate triumph and vindication of the race were the quintessential values of this seminal African ideology. The same values are the bedrock of today's nationalist Pan-Africanism, of which Afrikan Centered Education is one component. This brings us to a section called Paternalism. The slaveholders' stratagem of choice in the battle for the mind and soul of the African was the ideology of paternalism. And the principal weapons were the Christian church, followed in relative lethality by the criminal justice system, the white press, and white academia. The ideology of paternalism sought to convince both the enslaved and the slaveholder that slavery was the best of all possible worlds for the African, that the slaveholders were quote-unquote benevolent patriarchs who cared for, protected, and cherished their slaves. In return, the supposedly grateful and loyal servants labored happily and diligently to please their beloved masters. A central tenet of this ideology of paternalism was that Africans were traditionally godless pagans, or at best devil worshippers given to cannibalism. That Africans were not capable of self-government or civilization, and existed in darkness awaiting the civilizing effort of the white man. Africans were indeed the white man's burden. This paternalist ideological current is still prominent in the racist white supremacist ideology of Euro-Americans and their black apologists. I was going to say that too. I'm glad he said it right there. All right? This ideology convinced a few privileged quote-unquote house Negroes and provided the essential assumptions that underlay the latter development of accommodationism. Paternalism was fundamental in the thinking of the white missionaries who were instrumental in providing much of the educational experience available to free and enslaved Africans in antebellum America. Paternalism is alive today in white America, as evidenced by the response of the white press and academia to Afrocentric education. I think I'm going to end it there tonight. Yeah, I'm going to end it there tonight. If you're still with me, let me know what your thoughts are on this book, Nation Building, so far. Right? Let me know what your thoughts on this book, Nation Building, are so far. Shabaga E in the chat says, if war was a solution, then we must do it when we were united and organized. But for the most important, we must choose how it is going to be engaged and when. Quick station ID, if there's any last comments, I'll read those on the other side. If not, when I return, we'll end it there. And I'll continue the reading of this book next week, Tuesday.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
Greetings, fam. Tune in to The Learning Curve with me, the revolutionary matron, on KWAZ Radio. Have you ever considered joining KWAZ Radio? Each of our hosts shares their unique perspective with you. You might have a perspective that needs to be shared. If that's true, hit us up at kwaz.radio@gmail.com. What are you gonna do? What you gonna do?
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Check out all those shows. Also, give thanks to the Revolutionary Matron for that spot that she voiced for joining KWAZ Radio. We're looking for African spirituality podcasts. We're looking for African relationships podcasts, preferably, hosted by a couple, or at least an African man, African woman kind of situation. And we are also looking for, something came up the other day that just reminded me of it. Well, we also looking for someone to host a debate show. Someone who will facilitate hosting duties, as well as find the debaters, etc. We're looking to really have a good debate show on KWAZ Radio as well. So if that sounds like something, if any of those show ideas sound like something you or someone you know would be good at, if there's a small YouTuber right now that you like, that you subscribe to, that you follow, that you think, you know what, they will do good with and benefit from being in a podcast network such as this one, and of course the folks have to be African, Pan-African, African centered in all ways, etc. If you know someone like that, if you're that person, by all means let us know. Have them email kwaz.radio@gmail.com, pitch the idea, and if it happens, I personally will welcome you to the podcast network, and I'm sure the other hosts will too. In the chat room, the learning curve with the Revolution Matron says, I love the book. Thank you for the feedback. She says to this day, they feel like, paternalism. Well, what's crazy is that, again, for like the last 500 or so years, Europeans have utilized that paternalism not only to us, especially to us, but they've also used that with their own people. They kind of son their own people. If you really look at what's going on, a lot of their people, like if you look at their women, for example, their women don't have to be thinkers, right? They rely on the males. Right, so we've been swept up in all of that as well, and a lot of us have embraced it. When I talk about white mommy, white daddy, right? This is what I'm talking about as well. We're cool with it. Let them guys figure out how to organize a city. Let them guys figure out how to create trains, train stations and railroads and all that kind of stuff. That's where we are as a people right now, and that's what we got to get out of. It's time for us to separate and build. All right, I want to thank you guys who were here with me tonight. The Learning Curve with the Revolutionary Matron. Make sure tune into her show tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Shabaga E was here. Athrazer was here. KW Dawn 7 was here. The Pro-Black Perspective was here. Derico Cooper Photography was here. Peace to that brother. Who else? Mchaka 97 was here. Kevin Carre was here. Kevin Carre 42. NYC Beauties was here as well. Shout out to all of you for coming through. I'll be back on Thursday. I think I might be talking a little bit of economics on Thursday. So you guys make sure to tune in Thursday, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll see you there. Thanks for tuning in today. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.